I've seen a lot of things in my years of doing this, a lot of pain, a lot of anger, a lot of people who are just plain stuck. But every now and then a case comes along that isn't about being stuck. It's about being buried. Buried under a story so meticulously crafted, so polished and believable, that the truth doesn't stand a chance of seeing the light of day. And the person telling that story isn't looking for a shovel to dig their loved one out. No, they've come to me for a bigger, better bulldozer to finish the job. That's what I felt the first time I read the email from Mark. He presented himself as the quintessential concerned husband, articulate, calm, organized. He laid out his wife Sarah's supposed failings in a way that was both devastating and, on the surface, entirely reasonable. He used words like erratic, emotionally dysregulated, and unstable. He said she was creating a chaotic environment for their two children, an 11-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl. He claimed his life was a constant exercise in damage control, walking on eggshells, trying to be the stable parent while she spiraled. He attached video clips he'd taken on his phone, short, decontextualized snippets of Sarah crying, of her yelling in frustration, of a messy kitchen after a hectic morning. He had built a compelling case before he ever set foot in my studio. He had painted a picture of a saint married to a madwoman, and he wanted me to frame it for the world. My team did their pre-interviews, and the picture held. Mark was calm, consistent. He spoke with a kind of weary sadness that elicits sympathy. He wasn't angry. He said, just worried. For his kids, for Sarah. Sarah, on the other hand, was a mess. On the phone with my producers, she was defensive, she cried, she went on tangents that were hard to follow. She kept saying, but he's not telling you the whole story. He's not telling you what he did. When they'd ask what he did, her explanation would get tangled up in emotion, a flurry of accusations that, without context, sounded exactly like the ramblings Mark had described. She was unwittingly playing the part he had written for her. The labels were already sticking. Mark was the protector. Sarah was the problem. The kids were the victims. It's a simple, powerful narrative. And simple narratives are easy for people to swallow. But my job isn't to swallow the story I'm fed. My job is to look at the ingredients. And something in Mark's story was just too perfect. Life isn't that neat. A marriage doesn't just break down in one direction. It's a system, a dance. If one person is spinning wildly out of control, the other person is in that dance with them. They're either fanning the flames or they're the axis the whole chaotic spin is revolving around. When they arrived, I watched them on the monitors backstage. It's something I always do. You can learn more about a family dynamic in 5 minutes of them just sitting in a green room than you can in a 50-page email. Mark sat in a stiff back chair, legs crossed, scrolling through his phone. He was an island of tranquility. Sarah was pacing. She'd walk to the coffee machine, pour a cup she never drank, walk back to her chair, sit on the edge of it for a moment, then get up and start pacing again. She was a bundle of raw, frayed nerves. But it was the kids I was watching most closely. They sat on the couch, not looking at each other, not looking at their parents. They were just still. It wasn't a calm stillness. It was the stillness of a field mouse when a hawk is circling overhead. They had learned that the safest thing to do in the presence of their parents' turmoil was to become invisible. That told me more than any of Mark's video clips ever could. This wasn't a one-person problem. This was a systemic breakdown, and the kids were the smoke detectors screaming that the whole house was on fire. Mark just wanted me to help him change the batteries in his wife. I knew before I even walked out on that stage that this wasn't going to be about fixing Sarah's erratic behavior. It was going to be about excavating the truth she was trying to tell, a truth she was so beaten down and gaslit that she could no longer articulate it clearly. It was buried under years of his careful storytelling. and my job was to hand her a shovel. When we walked out onto the stage, the energy in the room was palpable. The audience had seen the intro package, the one with Mark's curated videos and his calm, pleading voiceover. They were already on his side. You could feel it. They saw a man at the end of his rope and a woman who was the cause of it all. Sarah felt it too. She sat down in her chair and seemed to shrink, pulling her cardigan tight around herself as if it were a suit of armor. Mark, however, sat forward, looking directly at me, ready to present his case. He was a man who had prepared for this moment. I started with him. I always give people the rope. Whether they use it to build a bridge or hang themselves is up to them. Mark, I said, you wrote to me because you say your home is in chaos and you believe your wife, Sarah, is the source of that chaos. Tell me what that looks like on a Tuesday morning. He didn't hesitate. He spoke fluently, calmly, describing a morning routine that sounded like a battlefield. He said Sarah would be frantic, yelling about lost shoes, forgetting to pack lunches, and then blaming him when the kids were late for school. He said he would try to de-escalate, to be the calm center of the storm, but that his calmness only seemed to make her angrier. He said, it's like she needs the drama, Dr. Phil. If there's no crisis, she'll create one. And the kids are just caught in the crossfire. As he spoke, he'd occasionally glance over at Sarah with a look of pained resignation. It was a masterful performance. He was playing the long-suffering husband to perfection. Then I turned to Sarah. Sarah, you just heard what your husband said. He's painting a picture of a woman who is emotionally out of control and creating a toxic environment for your children. What do you say to that? Her eyes filled with tears, just as I knew they would, just as he knew they would. It's not like that, she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. He's not telling you everything, he's twisting it. Then came the line I was waiting for. He never tells you what he did right before. Okay, I said, leaning in, this is important. Let's get out of the generalities. Give me a specific example. The last time you had a major blow-up, what happened right before? And this is where the system he'd built revealed itself. Sarah tried. She started talking about an argument they'd had the night before about a credit card bill. But her story was a tangled web of feelings, past resentments, and defensive statements. She'd say, he accused me of being irresponsible with money. And Mark would just shake his head slightly, a little smile on his lips, and say, that's not what happened, honey. We were just discussing the budget. He was doing it right there on my stage. He was calmly and rationally invalidating her reality. He used a tone of voice that was so reasonable, so patient, that to an outside observer, she was the one who sounded hysterical. Her frustration mounted, her voice got louder, her gestures more frantic, and in doing so, she became the exact person he had described in his email. He was a puppet master, and she was dancing on his strings. I had to stop the cycle. Hold on, I said, holding up a hand. Let's back up. Let's go way back. Was it always like this? When you two first met, what was the dynamic? Mark smiled. It was wonderful. She was so full of life, so spontaneous. Spontaneous, or as you would call it now, erratic? I asked. He was momentarily thrown, but he recovered quickly. Well, I suppose it's a matter of degree. I turned to Sarah. Sarah, what attracted you to Mark? He was so steady, she said, wiping her eyes. He was my rock. My family was kind of loud and emotional, and he was just calm. He made me feel safe. And there it was, the foundation of the entire dysfunctional structure. She saw his rigid control as stability. He saw her vibrant emotional life as a chaos he was meant to manage. From the very beginning, their roles were set. He was the container, and she was the wild substance to be contained. For a while, it probably worked. She felt grounded. He felt powerful and necessary. But that's not a partnership. That's a warden and a prisoner who doesn't realize she's in a jail. The control started small. I asked them about their first major decision as a couple. It was about a job offer Sarah had gotten in another city. She was excited about it. It was a huge opportunity. What happened, I asked. Sarah looked at Mark, a flicker of an old buried anger in her eyes. He talked me out of it. He had a whole list of reasons. The cost of living was too high. The schools weren't as good. It would take us away from family. It all sounded so logical. He made me feel like I was being selfish and foolish for even considering it. Mark, I said, is that how you remember it? I just wanted what was best for our future family, he said, his voice smooth as silk. I did the research. The numbers didn't lie. I was just being pragmatic. But I wasn't interested in the numbers. I was interested in the process. So you took her dream, her excitement, and you broke it down into a spreadsheet of pros and cons, and the cons, which you came up with, won. Is that about right? He didn't like that framing. I would say we made a logical decision together. No, I said, looking directly at Sarah. You didn't make a decision, you surrendered. You were told your feelings were irrelevant and that his logic was superior, and you believed him. That was the first brick in the wall of your prison, wasn't it? The look on her face told me everything. It was a dawning, a painful recognition of a truth she had been trained for 15 years to ignore. The problem wasn't the yelling on a Tuesday morning. That was just a symptom. The disease was the slow, methodical erosion of her sense of self, orchestrated by the very man who claimed to be her rock. That moment on stage was a pivot point. The air in the room shifted. You could feel the audience lean in, sensing that the simple narrative they'd been sold was starting to crack. Mark felt it too. His calm, composed demeanor began to show hairline fractures. His legs started to bounce a little. He kept clearing his throat. He was losing control of the story, and for a man like Mark, losing control is like running out of oxygen. I pushed further into the past. Let's talk about when your daughter Emily was born. What was that like? Sarah took a deep breath. It was like watching someone prepare to dive into icy water. It was hard, she said softly. I had a really difficult delivery. I had postpartum depression. I was exhausted. I was crying all the time. I felt like I was failing. And Mark, I turned to him. How did you support your wife during what is arguably one of the most vulnerable times in a woman's life? I did everything, he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge for the first time. I took care of the baby. I cooked. I cleaned. I told her she just needed to rest and pull herself together. I was trying to be the strong one. You told her to pull herself together? I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Your wife is describing clinical depression, a legitimate medical condition, and your advice was to just snap out of it? I didn't know it was clinical, he retorted. I thought she was just being dramatic. She was emotional. That's how she is. So you labeled her, I said. You didn't see a woman in pain, a woman struggling with a hormonal and psychological crisis. You saw a character trait. You saw dramatic. And by labeling it, you absolved yourself of the need to actually engage with her pain, didn't you? You didn't have to understand it. You just had to manage it. You just had to wait for her to stop. Sarah was weeping silently now. Not the hysterical tears from before, but tears of validation. These were tears of someone hearing their secret pain spoken out loud for the first time. She had been drowning, and he hadn't just failed to throw her a life preserver, he had told her it was her own fault she couldn't swim. This pattern, this dynamic of control and invalidation became the blueprint for their entire marriage. It bled into every aspect of their lives. I ask about parenting. Mark described himself as the logical parent, the one who set boundaries and rules. Sarah, he said, was the emotional parent, the one who was inconsistent and gave in too easily. Let's put some meat on those bones, I said. Give me an example. Mark was ready with one. Last month, our son Liam wanted to go to a concert on a school night. The rule is no concerts on school nights. I said no. Sarah, after he pleaded with her, said yes. She completely undermined my authority and created confusion for him. It sounded reasonable. On the surface, it's a classic parenting disagreement. Sarah, I asked, why did you say yes? Because, she began, her voice gaining a little strength, it wasn't just a concert, it was his favorite band. A band he loves because his best friend, who moved away last year, loves them too. He's been struggling with that, feeling lonely. He's a good kid, his grades are great, and I felt like he needed a win. He needed something to be happy about. I looked at Mark. Did you know any of that context? Did you know the emotional significance of this concert for your son? The rule is the rule, he said, his jaw tight. Feelings don't change the facts. If you start making exceptions for feelings, you have chaos. No, Mark, I said, leaning forward. If you ignore feelings, you have disconnection. You have children who learn that their internal world doesn't matter to their father. You're not teaching your son discipline. You're teaching him that his emotions are an inconvenience to your system of order. You're doing the exact same thing to your son that you've been doing to your wife for 15 years. You're telling him his reality's invalid if it doesn't fit into your neat and tidy box. The escalation in their home wasn't about Sarah suddenly becoming unstable. It was about the pressure cooker finally starting to explode. After years of having her perceptions denied, her feelings dismissed, and her identity whittled away, she had started to fight back in the only way she knew how. Her erratic behavior was a desperate scream for help from a woman who had been systematically silenced. The yelling, the crying, the messy kitchen, these weren't the actions of a crazy person. They were the protest of a prisoner rattling the bars of her cage. The tension came to a head about 6 months before they came to me. Sarah had started talking to a therapist, a fact Mark conveniently left out of his initial letter. What prompted that, Sarah, I asked. Emily, my daughter, she came to me, Sarah said, her voice dropping. She said she was worried about me. She said she saw Daddy talk to me the same way he talks to the dog when it does something wrong. She said, he doesn't talk to you like you're a person, Mom. That's what she said. The silence on the stage was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. And when my 14-year-old daughter sees it, Sarah continued, looking Mark straight in the eye, when she can see that her own father is slowly erasing her mother, I knew I couldn't live like that anymore. I knew I had to find my voice again, or my children would grow up thinking this is what love looks like. And it's not. This isn't love, it's control. The blame shifting had become extreme. Every time she tried to express her newfound awareness, he would catalog it as another symptom of her instability. She tried to talk about his condescending tone. He accused her of being oversensitive. She tried to set a boundary about his financial control. He accused her of being irresponsible. He was a master of psychological jujitsu. He used the weight of her own emotions to throw her off balance, then pointed to her stumbling as proof that she was the unstable one. He hadn't come to my show to fix his marriage. He had come to get the ultimate validation. He had brought his wife here for a public diagnosis, hoping I would be the one to finally, officially label her as the problem. Now, we were at the heart of it. The confrontation wasn't just going to be about Mark's behavior, it was going to be about the very nature of his reality, the foundation of his identity. For a man like him, a narcissist with deep-seated control issues, this is the ultimate threat. His entire world is built on the premise that he is the rational one, the stable one, the one who is always right. To challenge that is to challenge his very existence. I looked him dead in the eye. Mark, I said, my voice calm but firm, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You haven't come here to save your wife. You've come here to brand her. You've spent 15 years systematically dismantling this woman's self-esteem, piece by painful piece. You have labeled her emotions as drama so you wouldn't have to deal with them. You framed her needs as irrational so you could ignore them. You have used logic not as a tool for understanding, but as a weapon for control. You have gaslit her to the point where she can't even tell her own story without sounding, in your words, crazy. And now you've brought her on national television, not as a last resort to save your family, but as a final public act of invalidation. You wanted me to be the final judge who would declare her mentally incompetent, leaving you as the righteous, long-suffering victim. Am I getting any of this wrong? He was stunned. He just sat there, blinking. The audience was completely silent. This was not the show he had signed up for. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The smooth, articulate man from the beginning of the show was gone. In his place was a man scrambling, his fortress walls crumbling around him. That's a complete mischaracterization, he stammered, finally finding his voice. I love my wife. Everything I've done for the good of this family. No, I cut him off. Love doesn't do this. Love doesn't require a person to shrink. Love doesn't keep a running list of a partner's failings to be used as evidence in a trial. Love doesn't secretly record its partner at their most vulnerable moments to build a case against them. That's not love, Mark. That's control. That's emotional abuse. I let the term emotional abuse hang in the air. It's a heavy phrase, and I don't use it lightly, but it was the correct one. His abuse wasn't loud and obvious. It was quiet, insidious, and wrapped in the language of concern. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. He started to fight back, as I knew he would. This is the part where the manipulator, when exposed, tries to reclaim the narrative. You're twisting everything, he said, his voice rising. You're taking every single thing out of context. She agrees with me on half of this stuff. Tell him, Sarah. Tell him about your anger issues. Tell him how you overreact. He turned to her, not with a look of appeal, but with a look of command. It was a familiar move, a last-ditch effort to pull her back into their toxic dance. For a moment, I saw her hesitate. 15 years of conditioning is a powerful force. The urge to placate him, to smooth things over, was etched into her very being. I saw the conflict in her eyes, but then something shifted. She looked at him, then she looked at me, and then she looked out towards where I knew her children were watching backstage. She took a breath. And the woman who answered was not the shrinking, stammering woman who had walked onto the stage an hour ago. No, she said, her voice clear and steady. I'm not going to do that anymore. Do I have anger issues, Mark? Yes, because I am angry. I'm angry that I've been made to feel small for 15 years. I'm angry that my own husband sees my feelings as a character flaw. I'm angry that you've used our children as pawns in your game of control. So yes, I'm angry. But my anger isn't the problem. My anger is a symptom. It's an alarm bell. It's the only thing that's finally woken me up to the truth. That was the breakthrough. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was a moment of quiet, powerful clarity. It was Sarah reclaiming her own story. She was no longer accepting his labels. She was defining her own experience on her own terms. Mark was, for the first time, truly speechless. He had lost his most powerful weapon. His narrative had been dismantled. He just shook his head, looking from her to me, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He had come here for a coronation, and instead, he was witnessing a revolution. I turned to him again. The question mark is, what are you going to do now? Because your old way of operating is over. The game is up. You can either acknowledge the truth of what's been said here today, that you are a controlling man who has emotionally damaged his wife and family, and get the intensive, individual therapy you so desperately need to understand why you do this. Or you can continue to believe you are the victim, in which case I promise you, you will lose your family. Because this woman, I said, gesturing to Sarah, is not going back in her cage. Those children backstage are not going to unsee what they've seen. Your choice. He didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his jaw clenched. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered. And he didn't seem to like the look of the face underneath. The confrontation wasn't just with me or with Sarah. It was with himself. And it was a battle he was not prepared to fight. In that moment, he was no longer the calm, rational protector. He was just a small, angry man who had been found out. And the silence that followed was the most damning evidence of all. The aftermath of a moment like that is always uncertain. You've cracked open a system that has been sealed shut for years, and you don't know if the fresh air is going to help it heal or cause it to shatter completely. As the show ended and we went backstage, the difference in Mark and Sarah's demeanor was stark. Sarah was still crying, but the tears were different now. They weren't tears of frantic desperation. They were tears of release. She was surrounded by my female producers who were offering her tissues and quiet words of support. She was talking to them, really talking, about her daughter, about her hopes. It was like watching color seep back into a black and white photograph. She was reconnecting with a version of herself that had been dormant for a very long time. Mark was on the other side of the room on his phone. He wasn't yelling. He was speaking in a low, tight voice, but his posture was rigid with fury. He was already spinning the story, recasting himself as the victim of a television ambush. He was talking to his brother, I think, and I heard him say, "They completely ganged up on me." It was a total setup. He didn't once look at his wife. He didn't ask if she was okay. In his mind, the problem wasn't his behavior. The problem was that his behavior had been exposed. His only concern was damage control, not for his family, but for his own carefully constructed image. The kids were brought in to meet with them before they left. I made sure one of my top family counselors was in the room. I watched through a monitor. Emily, the 14-year-old, walked straight to her mom and hugged her, a long, fierce embrace. Liam, the 11-year-old, hung back, looking from his father to his mother, his face a mask of confusion and anxiety. He was a child caught between two opposing forces, unsure of where the safe ground was. Mark knelt down and tried to talk to him, putting on his concerned dad voice, but Liam just gave one-word answers, his eyes darting towards his mother and sister. The old alliances in that family were being redrawn right there in that green room. The gravitational center was shifting away from Mark for the first time, and the family system was in a state of flux. I offered them extensive resources, individual therapy for Mark to deal with his narcissistic and controlling behaviors, individual therapy for Sarah to rebuild her sense of self and learn to hold her boundaries, family therapy for all of them to try and create a new, healthier way of relating. I told Mark in no uncertain terms that his only path back to his family was through genuine, hard work on himself. He couldn't talk his way out of this one. He couldn't logic his way out of it. He would have to feel his way out of it, and I wasn't at all sure he had that capacity. Sarah embraced the plan. She was hungry for it. She called my office the very next day to get the referrals. She understood that this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. A painful, terrifying, but necessary beginning. She had to unlearn 15 years of being told she was too much, too loud, too sensitive, too wrong. She had to learn to trust her own perceptions again, to believe that her feelings were not just valid, but were in fact a vital guidance system. Mark, on the other hand, was a different story. He initially agreed to the therapy, but I believe he did so for purely strategic reasons. He saw it as a necessary hoop to jump through to regain control. My team followed up a month later. Sarah was deep into her individual therapy and reported feeling a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She and the kids had started their own family sessions, learning how to talk to each other without fear. But Mark had only gone to 2 sessions with his therapist. He had spent both sessions trying to convince the therapist that he was the actual victim and that my show had been a gross injustice. The therapist, a man I trust, told my producer that Mark lacked any capacity for self-reflection. He saw the problem as external to himself, and therefore he saw no reason to change. He dropped out of therapy after the 2nd session. This is the reality of what I do. You can't change people who don't want to be changed. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it look at its own reflection. Mark's narcissistic injury, the wound to his ego he sustained on my stage, was too great. Instead of seeing it as an opportunity for growth, he saw it as an attack to be defended against. The last update I got was about 6 months after the show. Sarah had made the difficult decision to separate from Mark. She had found a small apartment for herself and the children. She said it was hard that the kids missed their father, but that the peace in their new home was something none of them had ever experienced before. There was no more walking on eggshells. There was laughter. Emily was thriving in a new school drama club, finding her own voice. Liam was still quiet, still healing. But Sarah said she could see the tension leaving his small shoulders. She wasn't yelling anymore. She wasn't frantic, because the source of the chaos, the constant low-grade pressure to invalidate her own reality, was gone. She told my producer something that stuck with me. She said, "I realized I had a choice. I could spend the rest of my life trying to prove to him that I was a person, or I could just go be one." And she chose to go be one. It's not a fairy tale ending. Mark continues to tell anyone who will listen that his crazy, unstable wife left him and turned his kids against him. He will likely find another woman who is drawn to his initial steadiness, and the cycle will probably begin again. There's a profound sadness in that. A sadness for the man he could have been if he had the courage to be honest with himself. But there is also a profound victory. Sarah and her children got out. They broke the cycle. They chose a future that wasn't defined by his control. This was never a story about a husband with a problematic wife. It was a story about a woman who was buried alive and who, against all odds, found the strength to dig her way out. And sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for. Not a perfect resolution, but a real and courageous escape. It's important to understand the psychology of a man like Mark. It's not that he's just a liar. In his own mind, he's telling the truth. His entire psychological framework is built around a narrative where he is competent, rational, and good, and the world around him is chaotic and emotional. When Sarah's reality, her feelings, her needs, her very personhood collided with that narrative, his brain didn't reevaluate his own position. It simply reclassified her as a flaw in the system. Her pain was not evidence of his failure as a husband. It was evidence of her failure as a functional human being. It's a fortress of self-delusion. And what I did on that stage wasn't just challenge his story. I threw a wrecking ball at the fortress. His reaction, the anger, the blame shifting, the refusal to engage was not the reaction of a man who was misunderstood. It was the frantic, desperate reaction of a man trying to hold the walls up as they crumbled around him. He will likely spend the rest of his life patching those walls, using any material he can find to prove that he was right all along. The tragedy is that he's a prisoner inside that fortress, and he's the one holding the key, but he doesn't even see the door. For Sarah, the journey after the show was about learning to live outside the walls. It's a terrifying prospect when you've spent a decade and a half in a controlled environment. The world feels too big. The choice is too numerous. There's a period of profound disorientation. Every decision, from what to make for dinner to whether to take a new job, is freighted with the new responsibility of trusting yourself. For 15 years, she had an external voice telling her what was logical, what was right, what she should be feeling. The silence left by that voice's absence can be deafening at first. Her therapy was about learning to listen to her own voice again, to recalibrate her internal compass. It wasn't just about healing from Mark, it was about rediscovering herself. The spontaneous, full-of-life woman he once described hadn't died. She had just been put into a medically induced coma. Her recovery was the slow, painful process of waking up. There's grief in that. Grief for the lost years, grief for the marriage she thought she had, grief for the partner she wished he could have been. But on the other side of that grief is freedom. And you cannot forget the children. They are the silent witnesses, the ones who absorb the atmospheric pressure of a home without knowing how to name it. Emily, the daughter, was the canary in the coal mine. Kids, especially teenage girls, have a powerful barometer for emotional authenticity. She saw the condescension, the dismissiveness, and she knew in her gut that it was wrong. Her validation of her mother's experience was a critical turning point. It gave Sarah the strength to believe she wasn't crazy. Now, Emily is free to grow up in a home where a woman's voice is not a problem to be solved, but a force to be celebrated. Liam's path will be harder. For a young boy, a father is often the model for what it means to be a man. Liam learned from Mark that emotions are a liability, that control is strength, that logic is king. He now has to unlearn those toxic lessons. He has to learn from his mother and his sister that true strength lies in vulnerability, empathy, and the courage to feel. Sarah's greatest challenge and her greatest gift to her son will be to model a new kind of power, one that doesn't dominate but connects. In the end, this case was a stark reminder that sometimes the most profound abuse doesn't leave any visible bruises. It's the slow, methodical erosion of a soul. It's the weaponization of reason against feeling. It's convincing someone that their own reality is a delusion. Mark came to me with a very simple frame. He was the sane one, and his wife was the crazy one. He wanted me to hang his picture in that frame. But my job is to break the frame and look at the whole damn wall. The truth is rarely simple. It's almost always a complex, messy system of actions and reactions, of old wounds and learned behaviors. The real chaos in that home wasn't coming from Sarah's emotions. It was coming from Mark's relentless, suffocating control. Her erratic behavior was just the desperate gasps of a woman who was running out of air. She wasn't the problem with the kids. She was the one who was finally brave enough to show them what it looks like to choose to breathe. It's not a perfect storybook ending, but it's a real one. It's a story of liberation. And in this line of work, that's about as good as it gets.